and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. I'm Patrick Okigbo, Principal Partner Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving Africa's complex development problems. Most nations, especially in Africa, have a history of violent conflicts, repressions, human rights violations. What matters is how these societies address these issues. Today's discourse is focused on rule of law, security, and transitional justice in fragile and conflict-affected nascent democracies. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but we'll get to unpack all the issues. Chidi Odinkalu is Professor of Practice in International Human Rights Law at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. He previously chaired Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission and served on the panel of eminent persons that negotiated the return of the Gambia to the Commonwealth in 2017. He very recently chaired the Truth, Justice and Peace Commission, a transitional justice initiative established to address the crisis of violence and agitations in the states of Southeast Nigeria. Odinkalu acted as a counsel in international human rights litigation before Africa's regional human rights courts and tribunals, and was involved in creating the African Court on Human and People's Rights. He's associated with several advocacy initiatives for the protection of human rights, including the International Refugee Rights Initiative. His research focus is on contemporary challenges of multilateralism in regional systems, in development, human rights, and governance. He co-authored Too Good to Die, Third Term, and the Myth of the Indispensable Man in Africa. Chidi, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Patrick. Good afternoon.
Fantastic. Let's start with some basic concepts. And here I just want to explore a bit the nature of democracy in Nigeria. Our governance system, some commentators argue that democracy is not working in Nigeria or in Africa, and that that Africa indeed may not even be able to have an effective democracy because of its history, culture, societal structures. Where do you sit on this debate?
I don't know whether I'm sitting or standing, to be perfectly honest with you. But no, thanks again for having me, and to the participants, everyone who has made time to join. There are lots of things people could be doing with their time at this, on this particular day. So I just want to say thank you as well to everyone who's joining. I really don't think it's too, for me, the question is not too complex, and for obvious reasons. I think the colonial encounter, before colonialism, the encounter with slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, more or less, disarticulated Africa's trajectory. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you've located this. You described Nextier as being preoccupied with Africa's complex development challenges. Mm-hmm. So this conversation is located within Africa. Quite often, as Nigerians, that you and I are, and Nigeria being a rather big country in Africa, we suffer this crisis of the big country mentality. So for most Nigerians, there are only two countries in Africa, Nigeria and the others. And that means that we lack perspective, and everything invariably then degenerates into mutual bile and antipathies and intertribal warfare, to use a rather denuded expression. Mm-hmm. And so I like to look at this within the complex of Africa as a continent, and our peoples on the continent. Now, because our trajectory was disarticulated, people no longer have a sense of memory of what kinds of societies we ran. They may not have been perfect democracies, but conceptually, at least, the idea of participation of the people in legitimizing their government was fundamentally accepted, whether you were dealing with the acephalous African societies or with the chiefly ones, and whether you were dealing with societies that suffered transformation through conflict, or indeed ones that were not. Howsoever you looked at it, that idea was fundamentally understood and accepted. Now, in the aftermath of colonialism, that trajectory kind of changed. And for me, Jerome Udoji's autobiography provides the perfect summary for what has transpired. The title of Jerome Udoji's autobiography, and he came from Ozubulu in Anambra State, is Under Three Masters, right? And he describes, because Udoji was a bureaucrat, a civil servant. He served the colonial masters, and then he served the post-colonial civilian masters, and then he served the post-colonial military masters. And he tells the story in a very riveting fashion. It's under 200 pages, published by Heinemann in 1995. And I'd recommend that autobiography for anyone who wants to understand where we are. It is this idea of being under a succession of masters, I think, that we're battling with. The mentality of masterhood really is what leads us to this idea that democracy, which really is foundation of government on popular legitimacy, that it is problematic. So that's where I come down on this, that I have no problems at all. On the contrary, I do think that if you follow the logical trajectory of our continent, Cape to Cairo, you'll come to the conclusion that democracy is natural to Africa. It is Africa's rulers that have problems with it.
Okay, so I like the way you situated it within Jerome Udoji's autobiography. But let me also introduce Ali Maziriu's The Triple Heritage, right? And, he had that brilliant documentary that ran, back in, I think, in the 80s or so, where he situates it in first of all, our Africanness, our traditional Africanness, the influence of the Western influence, and also Islam. Do you see that what we have is that we're stuck in this vortex where we've really lost sense of who we are? There's so many influences that we haven't been able to evolve a system that represents who we are and that can work within our mores and our values.
Completely. And in many ways, I'd add another piece by Professor Mazrui, which was an article, actually, pretty influential article he wrote for Political Science Quarterly in 1968, before I was born, actually, or before you and I were born. Right. But the title is Political Assassinations in Africa. And Mazrui argued that in post-colonial Africa, the continent was dealing with, and he told the story, of course, of assassinations in Africa, starting with Lumumba and Congo, and coming down to President, what's his name, who was killed in Togo in 1963, January 1963, and down to Balewa, and then to Nkrumah, and the overthrow of Nkrumah. But basically, he focused on the assassinations. And he explained political assassinations in post-colonial Africa with reference to two things. One was a crisis of state legitimacy and state building, nation building, which he termed a crisis of horizontal relationships between the populations of the post-colonial cartographies of Africa. And the second was a crisis of regime legitimacy, of the acceptance or acceptability of the rulers of each of those territories to their people. And his argument was that in the aftermath of Berlin, February 1885, and what transpired, and then thereafter, in the aftermath of the colonial retreat, that what you had was a challenge of forging countries in which the populations accepted themselves as co-owners of the territory and therefore worked out rules of coexistence mutually. And also those people then accepting those who wielded power as the people who had legitimacy to rule them. And when that did not happen, he said, because of the fragilities, to use one of our anchor expressions here, those fragilities resolve themselves through assassinations. And in many ways, that theory, in many ways, still holds valid in some form. I think the consequences have become attenuated as countries have come to accept some, work out some of those things. But many of our countries, and Nigeria is one of them, have failed to do that in a way that enables and promotes coexistence, which leads to your first question about democracy and its challenges.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is something that I really struggle with, right? Because if we look at everything we're going to say about Africa, all of our experiences, our history before, the transatlantic slavery and colonialism, etc., we can locate some of those experiences even in other continents, right? So, and in these continents, they have also gone through some kind of a transition to democracy. It's been faster in many of them. So if you take like Eastern Europe, Soviet Union breaks up, within a decade, they've put down real solid roots for stable democracy. You look at, say, Latin America, it takes them a few decades, but they've arrived somewhere. Africa, for half a century, has struggled with this, and we still remain a nascent democracy. Is it that this is just totally alien to us? It's never going to work. We should just avert our minds to evolving a new system, or is there something we are missing? I'm just really trying to understand, are we backing up the wrong tree, or is this going to lead somewhere? If it's going to lead somewhere, what are the elements that need to be in place?
Well, I think there's no one-size-fits-all in this. If you looked at East Africa, for instance, at independence, at least, Nyerere, this is a story I heard directly from Nyerere in London, while he was battling terminal cancer in '98. And he said, look, when we were getting to independence, we'd had the federation, the East African Federation. And he was the youngest of the three leaders in East Africa, himself, Apollo, and Mzee. Apollo in Uganda, Mzee in Kenya. And he wanted to slow down independence so the three of them could go to independence as one united territory. But the Mzee, Kenyatta in Kenya, suspected him that, why would this young man not want to be in charge of his country? Why does he want all of us to do this thing together? And Kenyatta was already an old man. And for some reason, Kenyatta believed that the reason was that Nyerere was going to wait him out to die and then take over Kenya. And so because of that, Kenyatta refused to have the three of them go to independence as one territory. And so they went to independence as separate territories. Now, and in many ways, Kenya then forged ahead and was seen as a model of progress. Nyerere slowed down Tanzania deliberately because he believed that he needed to build a nation in order to make progress. And so the East Africans laughed at Tanzania for over 2 decades because they were too slow. In school, he insisted every kid had to learn Kiswahili, irrespective of where you came from. And Tanzania is very diverse ethnically, in terms of religion and everything, and in terms of its geographies, north to south. And now, long after Nyerere has died, Tanzania is now the fastest growing economy in East Africa. Its prospects are much brighter, and it's a more resilient country, precisely because Nyerere did those very difficult things that were required. A coherent Tanzanian identity exists in a way that you do not have in Kenya. In Kenya, the Jaluo are different from the Kikuyu, and you have the Luya. It's everywhere, including their football, for instance, which is my joke with Kenyans. The Luo and the Luya in Western Kenya, you will not know the difference, indeed, in terms of dialects. But what happens? The Goma here is the leading football club of the Luo identity in Kenya. If you hear Go, it is Luo. AFC Leopards is Abaluya Football Club. It is for the Luya. And if you are Luo, you cannot play for AFC. If you're Luya, you cannot play for Goma here. And the contest between these two clubs boils over into fratricide sometimes.
Yeah.
If you go to Ghana, you've got Accra Hearts of Oak, right? Up north. Accra Hearts of Oak, you have Accra Hearts of Oak, which is allied to a political party and to the Ga identity. And you've got Ashanti Kotoko, which is allied to yet another political party, the ruling party in Ghana as we speak. Hearts of Oak is allied to the opposition party in Ghana as we speak, and to the Ga. Ashanti Kotoko are the Ashanti Football Club, and never the twain shall meet. So you have a perfect symmetry between ethnic identity, political allegiance, and football identity. And all of these get into this vortex that you're talking about that can be very combustible. Now, I've not used the Nigerian example because we may be very familiar with it. But these things, and I could go on to Cameroon, for instance, you know, Tonnerre Kalala and Union Douala, Fundi and Littoral and all of that. These African things, and sometimes when you want to have these conversations in Nigeria, you cannot because people say Okigbo is Igbo, and therefore, and so people can't imagine themselves as beyond this, and we therefore struggle to create a transcendental elite conversation that can help enable us forge a country that can work.
Let me throw in maybe my last question on this democracy business before we move to conflict. So you look at all of this, and you can see where, if not managed, where this could lead to, right? And Rwanda presents a good example, you know, how unchecked they went into their genocide and suffered such calamity. But then you have a Paul Kagame, you know, who comes up, definitely not the epitome of democracy. You can say a benevolent dictator, and he forces the country, you know, he's trying to force a common identity. We saw that in Singapore, again, not a benevolent dictator forcing a common identity. In Cuba, in Turkey with Kemal Atatürk. Does that then justify this rising argument for a benevolent dictatorship, given that democracy has continued to struggle in Africa?
Again, I don't know. I think, you know, as I said, I don't sign up to a one-size-fits-all narrative. And going back to the last penultimate question, you know, if you look at Asamoah Robinson, Why Nations Fail, they tell the story of Mexico, for instance, and indeed of Latin America. Okay, now the colonization of Latin America, for particular historical reasons, the collapse of the Spanish Empire happened around the same time, actually, that we had the jihad in Nigeria in the first decade of the 19th century. And so Mexico, for instance, became independent in 1810. And Mexico's first 50 years were very, very unstable. Our first 70 years, they had over 50 presidents in the first 70 years. And then things stabilized relatively. You know, the PRI took over, and then the PRI ran the country for nearly 1 century. And now you're also not having a transition, at least since the 1990s, you know, beginning of this, the end of the millennium into the beginning of this one, we've now had a transition into a different set of factors. Now, and I do think we are somewhere here. Every country is unique. We could you know, excavate Rwanda's own histories and what has created them, that particular history, and also explore the trajectory that is now happening. Because, I mean, you know, in East Africa, there are 2 dominant ethnic identities. Most people don't realize this. One are the Banyarwanda. And the Banyarwanda are found in DRC, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. The other are the Jaluo. The Luo are found in Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. The difference was that the Banyarwanda, by a particular historical circumstance, ended up with a homeland in Rwanda. But most Rwandese actually are not in Rwanda. They are in the neighboring countries. You've got more Banyarwanda outside. Museveni, for instance, is Munyarwanda. And Paul Kagame was exiled by the first cycle of genocides pre-independence in 1959 as a child into Uganda. He joined Museveni, indeed, Paul Kagame and Afande Fred Rwigema, who founded the RPF, were both in Uganda as Ugandans carrying Ugandan passports. They were in the Ugandan RPF,
Army,
the Ugandan National Resistance Movement with Museveni. Paul Kagame, Rwigema then left to start off the RPF. He was killed in the second week of the campaign, and Paul Kagame, who was undergoing a military training in the US, abdicated, returned to Rwanda to take over the RPF, and the rest is history. But you've got to see that trajectory to understand why these guys are where they are. Now, we can explore that with other countries. And with us in Nigeria, part of this is that we actually have this mutual aversion to our histories. You know, history is banned in the country in some form, whether they have resuscitated it or not. We actually are not interested in exploring our mutual histories. And you still have too few Nigerian scholars interested in the mutual exploration of our anthropologies, whether it is an Igbo student going to a Fulani settlement, a Fulbe settlement to understand how that works, or a Hausa person, not a Hausa Fulani, no, I said Hausa, as different from Fulani, or Afizere, or Efik, or Ibibio, crossing ethnic boundaries to just study that. And I think we need to start to encourage all of that and not allow our history to be what it is that the white people told us that it was, because a lot of that was misrepresentation. If we are not interested in that, I don't think we can make progress.
And thank you for that. And so switching gears a little bit, let's talk a bit about, the judicial system, rule of law, and why it's just been difficult for us to have a system that represents and protects the rights of Nigerians, of Africans. If you could just unpack for us, this, in my view, steady but consistent decline in rule of law as the governing, framework for societies. What has caused it? Where are we today? And what can we do about it?
Gosh, don't get me started. I'm just completing a manuscript on that, actually, because I actually think, I happen to think that we have sold ourselves, and particularly our law students and also political science students, a lie, which was that rule of law was the foundation of our society. For every colonized society, that is a lie, because colonialism was incompatible with the idea of a rule of law. Colonialism was by definition arbitrary. And so they will tell you, oh, we became independent from the British, and it was founded on rule of law, independence of the judiciary. That is worse than myth. That is a lie. And under the Brits, by the way, judges did not have tenure. They did not have protected tenure. They could be removed at will. No, I'm not making this up. That is what the law was. That's jurisprudence of colonialism. And so the colonial secretary could simply, if you were trying to invent a mind of your own, they could cancel you, full stop. Cancel culture did not begin today. It started in colonialism, okay? Now, after colonialism, as a matter of our history, by 1960, at independence, they gave us a constitution with the Judicial Service Commission. That was canceled in 1963. Why? Because the politicians wanted control over judicial appointments. Awolowo's trial was a classic example in 61-62. Now, and Awolowo's trial followed the collapse of the trial of Paul Tarka. And we can go into details in Tivland of what transpired there. But after that, they then tried Awolowo for treasonable felony. That case was to be assigned to Justice Dade Onyama then. But Dade Onyama was not trusted because his reputation was as a very strict judge who would not brook interference. So they decided to take the file away from him and give it to Shode Ndesho Wemimo. And that is how My Hands Are Tied came about. Yeah. And shortly after that trial, they canceled the Judicial Service Commission. We did not return to the Judicial Service Commission in our constitution until 1979. But ahead of the 1979 transition, you had the transition in the office of Chief Justice from Daniel Alexander and you had instability in that office from the transition to the in 1972 when Chief Justice Ademola retired, and they then appointed Taslim Elias, who had been Attorney General, had never held judicial office. Again, for reasons we could explore if you wanted to. And then in 1975, Elias was forced to resign, and they then went to a Caribbean non-national, Daniel Alexander, and appointed him. That upset everyone in the system. And then people started looking after themselves. By 1979, they corrected in another direction and put in Fatai Williams. And when you read, I'm putting out this story in another 4 or 5 months. But when you read the story of that transition, you will understand how we ended up where we are, with a judiciary that lacks independence, lacks autonomy, has always relied on the politicians for green-lighting what they should do. That began shortly after our independence, and people would argue before independence, because before independence, sorry, I'm taking a little bit of time on the history of this because we need to understand it. Justice Olumuyiwa Ajibowu was the first Nigerian High Court judge and Supreme Court justice, and he was supposed to be the person to become Chief Justice. But a political scandal was confectioned around the time that the vacancy fell open in 1958 to make sure he was eliminated so that somebody else was appointed, and that was what happened. And that was an entirely invented political scandal. Since then, we have been battling to wrestle independence or to infect our judiciary with some modicum of independence. It has got worse progressively.
I'll come back to what you think could be the solution. I haven't gotten to the solution part yet. I'll come back to that. And when we get there, I'll be looking at what is it that the people can get their political class to do. But let me focus a bit on the political class. There's this great book by Rebecca Bill Chavez, The Rule of Law in Nascent Democracies, where she argued that political fragmentation is a necessary condition for rule of law to take roots in a society, right? So for instance, she argued that party competition sets the stage for independent courts, and that if, for instance, you don't have that competition, if you lack that effective opposition, then you could end up with the situation we have in Nigeria today, where the Supreme Court appears to be available, to any party that is in office. Do you, first of all, agree with this argument? If yes, I want to now go into what happened. What happened to Nigeria's political system where we ended up with a system where we effectively do not have an opposition party?
To some extent, there is merit, in my opinion, and only my opinion, in the argument, but only to some extent. But it's only in my sense, in my view, it's in an indirect way.
Okay.
Ultimately, it is strong civics that, for me, must guarantee judicial effectiveness and the rule of law.
Okay.
And where the civics are not, now, to have strong civics, the party competition needs to exist. And the parties become, midwives of the relationship between civics and political power. So that it's also the case that where the parties fail, the civics will punish them by withdrawing legitimacy or to their claims for political office. Now, the judiciary then underwrites that by supervising the applicable rules. I think what has happened is the politicians have disincentivized strong civics through a mixture, and the military, I think, have also played a role in that, but through a mixture of carrot and stick. And the absence of those incentives, and part of that is actually the weaponization of impoverishment. Because hungry people are not going to be trading in the currency of accountability. They are going to be trading in stomach infrastructure.
Correct.
And progressively over time, and we can go into the history of Nigeria's political economy, it's been a long scale, particular, and in my view, since the Yom Kippur War, since 1973. Since Gowon told us that we had more money than we had problems, I think we have been in a skid. And you can easily see the trajectory, actually, to where we are now. And because of that disincentive to an effective civics, it's meant that we've been unable to build political coalitions that can play that role of underwriting judicial independence. And the judiciary, at the end of the day, are peopled by politicians. Let's be perfectly honest. Argentina's former Chief Justice said every judge is a politician. You see,
as we're seeing even in America, even at the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Yes. Now, the judges understand that sometimes the judiciary is not an instrument of revolution. Again, let's be honest with that. The judiciary is an instrument of the status quo. If you're asking the judiciary institutionally to defect to a new political dispensation, you've got to back them up with civic authority, civic power. So you can see the example of Malawi in 2020, where you had a government that was short of legitimacy. They had written up a result that was clearly fake. And they were looking, in order to validate that result, to sack the judiciary, the Chief Justice, Justice Nyirenda, replace him with a more pliable figure so that they could get a judgment they wanted. What happened? The people lined up behind their Chief Justice took to the streets to make the country ungovernable. So the government could not sack that Chief Justice. And that enabled the judiciary to pivot, to defect in support of the new dispensation. If you do not have that kind of system in which the judiciary sees that they can get popular support if they were to defect, they will not be able to do that because the judiciary lacks guns, they lack money, they lack a cavalry. And I do think that is where the problem is. In Nigeria, again, returning home, we do not have politicians. The last politician who was able, there were two politicians who were able more or less to kind of play in that territory. One was Obafemi Awolowo, the other was Aminu Kano, in different ways and to different degrees. But the others, most Nigerian politicians are in the enterprise of stomach infrastructure. And so the foundations for this kind of argumentation, popular argumentation, do not exist in my view. And that is even much worse now.
So what happened to our civics? So you've kind of located it on, if the people are poor, they're focused on daily meal, they may not have the luxury of dealing with some of these issues that we may even consider esoteric. But beyond that, I mean, we were poor in the 1980s, but we still had a very robust civil society, pushing for things that, for the most part, reflected where the masses were. The Ghanese, the Bekos, the Fellas, even yourself, Innocent Chukwuma, people of the like. What has happened? What has happened that today it appears we don't even have any voices, speaking up for the masses? It cannot just be economic.
Well, I learned it from Gani Fawemi. If you're going to take on the stage, first you've got to be able to feed yourself. Gani was very clear about that. And, all the people that you mentioned now, whether you start from the north, Yusuf Bala Usman, Gani, Femi, Beko, all these people are middle-class people. None of them was hungry. Olisa Bakoba, name them. All of these were middle-class. Beko Ransom Kuti was one of the first Nigerians to own a computer. His mother was the first Nigerian woman to drive a car, right? Fela, from Wole Soyinka from that same family. And I could go on. So that economic foundation, I'm sorry to sound old-style Marxist here, but I don't apologize for that either. The economic foundation for resistance and struggle is very basic. And the military understood that. They took that away. And by assaulting that, and two examples from the period that you described, 1983 elections, Anambra State and Ondo State. In Anambra State, Jim Nwobodo went up against Christian Ono.
CC.
In Ondo State, Akin Omoboriawo went up against Michael Ajashin. It was a contest between the UPN and NPN in Ondo State and the NPN against the NPP in Anambra State. The outcomes were the same thing. The NPN stole the elections in both states. And so the contest ended up in the Supreme Court. The outcomes were different. By 6-1, the Supreme Court overturned the elections in Ondo State and returned the verdict to the UPN that manifestly won the election, square and fair. Why did they do that? Because in Ondo State, the people decided that Omoboriawo was never going to have peace and NPN was never going to be able to retain that mandate that they had stolen. And so they were willing to do whatever it took, make the state ungovernable in order to preserve that mandate.
But they were hungry then too, Chidi. They were hungry. The people were hungry then.
The people may have been a little hungry, but they also were sure that there was an opposition political party behind whom they could line up.
Okay.
So you had a coincidence of those two things, strong civics and strong opposition. And because of those two things, the Supreme Court just meekly told them, please, take whoever you said you want. The Supreme Court justices were not idiots. They recognized who won the elections. They lived in Nigeria. In Anambra State, the exact opposite happened. By a majority of 6-1, the Supreme Court upheld the theft by NPN. Why? Because Anambra State people went to market. Their hunger was too much and they could not defer the consequences of the hunger. And NPP in Anambra State was not prepared to provide leadership in opposition. That, for me, says something. Judges are not idiots. They understand the message from the people. But when the people have been demobilized, judges are not going to lead your revolution for you.
Let me push one more point here before we move to security. So at the early days of this dispensation, this republic, we had the PDP in power. You had an executive, but you also had the National Assembly. And the leadership of the National Assembly worked almost like an opposition party, in checking the excesses of the executive. Without that leadership, we probably will still be under an Obasanjo regime at this time, right? But what we have today, it appears that the National Assembly is one and the same with the executive. Things come to the National Assembly, they pass it within 24 hours, 48 hours. What has happened? What has happened between 99 to date? And it cannot be economic because these are not poor people, So what has happened that has even removed the bites, the fangs, defanged the National Assembly? It is not the 1999 to 2007 National Assembly that we have today.
This is a complex set of things in my view, but for me, I think very clear set of things. Electoral democracy is built on one thing, on uncertainty of outcomes and certainty of rules. Indeterminate outcomes and determinate rules. In Nigeria, in 1999, that was actually pretty much the case. You could not quite say this person was a shoe-in. But then the soldiers also did not quite return to the barracks in 1999. It was a slow, they changed their clothes but retained power. They changed their uniforms to civilian uniforms but retained power. And so the civilian resistance was still strong to the idea of soldiers running the system. Now, but the soldiers set about re-engineering the system from indeterminate rules, from indeterminate outcomes to determinate rules, indeterminate outcomes. They made it determinate outcomes and indeterminate rules. When you ally that to increasing immiseration, you get an explanation for where we are now. I will declare my interests. Godswill Akpabio was my classmate and neighbor in Nigerian law school. And our children went to school together and we're, in that sense, decent family friends. But Godswill Akpabio was not supposed to be in National Assembly. When you read the jurisprudence of how he ended up in the Senate at this time, or how his predecessor, Senate President, ended up, you're ashamed for our Supreme Court. You get ashamed for the kind of jurisprudence we have invented. But it's the jurisprudence that has done something very dangerous. Judges have toppled our people as the sources of popular legitimacy. So for the Nigerians who are here now, your votes no longer count.
Exactly.
Because elections are supposed to be by the people. And the votes of the people determine who wins, irrespective of which part of Nigeria you're talking about. That is what it is. But now, after INEC has announced election results, you spend another 1 year waiting for who the real winners are, because that is when the true elections begin. Judges are casting the votes. They are casting votes all over the country. And those votes are not cast for altruistic reasons. They are bought and sold. And you sit down with any politician across the country, at whatever level, from the presidency to councillor, they will tell you the amount of money they spend on judges. And now, when you go into elections, first, this is why everyone now wants to own a judge in their bedroom. And when you go into election petitions, you don't just hire SANs. You now hire what they call judicial consultant or judicial liaison. That is the person who will tell you what the judges want as money, pay off for the judgment. It doesn't end there. I was with a very senior lawyer not too long ago. I will not say more than that. And this senior lawyer said that he has stopped going to court. He's one of the most senior lawyers in Nigeria. He stopped going to court. Why? He did a case in which the most senior advocate was this judicial liaison. And this judicial liaison instructed them to write 2 judgments, one against and one for. On the day of the judgment, one of those judgments was read word for word. And he said he cannot in good conscience continue to go to court knowing that this is what happens. This was an election petition. And everyone who has watched an election petition or participated in one knows this is what happens. But if you say it, you get called names. But now I'm saying it because my name is useless to me in the kind of country that we are.
Thank you, Chidi. And by the way, for participants, if you've got any questions, please put it in the Q&A section. We'll get to it in another 15 or 20 minutes, and we'll attribute the questions to you. But I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about insecurity in Nigeria. Chidi, quite recently, you headed up the Truth and Justice Committee in Anambra State, looking at the conflict in the southeastern part of Nigeria. If you can unpack for us, what's at the roots of the more difficult, violent conflicts we're experiencing across Nigeria. If we understand what the roots are, then we can begin to look at the elements of the solution.
That's a difficult thing to exhaust in the time that we've got. But I'll just be fairly, I'll try and lay the outlines quickly. When I was going into that, I had I was given certain impressions. I had certain assumptions. Obviously, I come from the Southeast. My parents are buried in the Southeast. But absolutely every one of my assumptions went out of the window. First of all, there's a fixation with the short term. You cannot understand what is happening in the Southeast without going back to 1997, 1998. That's the first thing. The violence, the transition from OTA, the Onitsha Traders Association violence in 1998, and the assassination of the Igwamobi of Ogidi.
Okay.
If you have to go back that far, 1998, to understand, and then the contest between OTA and the Bakassi boys and what happened, and the guns that came into the region as a result. And a lot of those guns came in from the Niger Delta. And then those Niger Delta guns went up to the Northeast. And those guns from the Northeast returned to the Niger Delta, to the Southeast and Niger Delta through River Niger, through the inland waterways. And it was amazing to find out all of this. And what that meant was that we just had a transition in the different forms of violence from Bakassi through to the political godfathers, through to the early beginnings of the banditry in 2009-10. In 2 months into 2011, I don't know whether you remember, but the Igwe of Adazin-Nuk and the Igwe of Ihembosi were disappeared. None of them has been found till date, right? And so from the political godfathers, we went to Masob. From Masob, we went to that banditry. From that, we went into unknown gunman, and Peter Obi's Commissioner for Science and Technology, who came from Nanka, was disappeared in 2014. He's not been seen since then. Anambra State's former deputy governor was assassinated in abducted and then killed in 2013. People forget all of these things. And when those things happened, we were told they were killed by unknown gunmen. Today, we think unknown gunman is IPOB. The least, what struck me was, and I say this with a huge sense of, with a huge weight on my shoulders, IPOB is the smallest of the security problems the Southeast has. As I speak to you, IPOB is no longer a problem in Ihiala. You know what the biggest problem in Ihiala is? Ihiala local government area, cults. In Oka, cults. In Obosi, in much of Idemili, north and south. And you come from Idemili, south, correct?
Correct.
It's cults. Correct. The place has been taken over by cults. And the killings are dreadful. Every day, kids are being popped left, right, and center by cults. And people think this is IPOB.
And these are street gangs, for non-Nigerians.
Absolutely.
These are street gangs, yeah.
Precisely. And now the most dangerous place, so it's easy to delimit the place where IPOB is, and it can be liquidated if we really want to do that. There are conversations I don't want to reveal, but it's very easy to liquidate IPOB, at least those people who claim to be doing IPOB work. It's, we were able to delineate very closely. The political geography is very limited. But when you excise that, the biggest problem you have in the Southeast is cults, and their violence is seasonal. When they are not doing political violence and the politicians protect them, big time, the politicians arm them. The politicians finance them. When they are not doing that for the politicians, they are selling violence to whoever can buy it. And when they're not doing that, they are killing one another in intercult warfare. If we do not, and then the trade in guns comes in from Nigeria's littoral territory, is connected in some parts with what is happening in southwest Cameroon, because those guns connect the maritime domain of Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, parts of Gabon, and Cameroon. And you then get into some of these other territories that we are simply not prepared to understand. The last thing I would say about this is this. The security services do not want to do what is required, many of them. I've also met high-level security officers who are interested, but they are drowned out by people who take a transactional view of this matter. You see, as long as you're saying it is secession, it's IPOB, it is good money, because government will say it impacts our territorial integrity. But if it is good old intelligence and law enforcement, they don't want to do that because it is not as lucrative. And when you speak to some of the governors in the Southeast, they now understand that. They know that they are being extorted by some of the security officers who are supposed to provide leadership in this. And that is why you've had, in some form, swift turnover in some of those leaders. I'll stop there.
Let me touch on something you've worked on. You've worked on for probably the better part of the last decade and a half, before we now move to solutions, and that's statelessness, and I know your work in the space, and it kind of touches on the farmer-herder conflicts, that we have, not just in Nigeria, but also in Mali and, Niger and, some other parts of Africa, where you have Africans who, for whatever reason, maybe violence in their home, maybe just climate change, has caused them to move further out to graze their cattle and bring them closer in proximity to farmers, and it leads to conflict. If you can speak within a minute or so on the work you've done on statelessness and how that also plays into the violence we're seeing mostly within the north-central part of Nigeria?
And there are different dimensions to statelessness issue in Africa. One of them is state succession, the fact that our boundaries are very arbitrary and people were cut up into different parts. So in Kenya, for instance, you had two brothers. One was Minister for Integration in Uganda. The other was Deputy President for Kenya. Same father, same mother. Yeah, that's the Awori brothers.
Yeah.
In West Africa, the boundary between Ghana and Togo is in Lomé, for instance. And for those who are Nigerian, if you travel across the country, if you go to Ilela, for instance, you will not know when you cross from Nigeria into Niger Republic in the northwest. And you can replicate that in different parts of the country. And say the nomadic populations of Nigeria are across West Africa. They start from the south of Morocco, right down through, and part of that, and they are connected also, not just by ethnicity, but also by faith. The Tijaniya sect in Islam was founded in Morocco by an Algerian sheikh and actually traveled down to Gabon, for instance. And so there are strong connections there. But most of West Africa's nomads are actually undocumented. We don't know what their nationalities are, and they don't have proof of their nationalities. They claim the entire territory. And there's not been any effort to try and address that. So state succession, livelihood adaptations amongst two of the major factors this is something I've worked on over 25, 28 years now. Done quite some litigation, represented Kenneth Kaunda when the Zambian government wanted to denationalize him in the 1990s because KK's mother and father came from Nyasaland, Malawi. But he was born in Zambia, grew up in Zambia, became a trade unionist, became their first president. But when he wanted to run, having left power in 1992-93 or been defeated, when he wanted to run again 5 years later, his successor, Fred Chiluba, remembered that his parents came from Malawi and told him that he was not Zambian. So one morning, an aircraft landed in Lusaka with instructions to fly him back to his country, Malawi, where he had never been. The Kaunda family, by the way, is in 3 African countries, Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania. So General Andrew Nyirenda, the man who took Tanganyika's flag to the top of Kilimanjaro Mountain at independence, was Kaunda's nephew. He was the son of Kaunda's immediate elder sister. And these were consequences of colonial, and in the end, the 3 wings of that family were threatened with statelessness. So I worked on that case and worked on another case in Botswana, which between them, they provided inspiration with the late Tajuddin Abdurrahim for the work. And Taju actually became stateless in Nigeria, by the way, under Sani Abacha. And Taju himself was an Ogbomosho who actually came from Funtua in Katsina State, in Katsina South. So we worked together on that. And, over 17 years, managed to put together a continental protocol on statelessness, which only got adopted 2 months ago. I'm actually, as we speak, in Addis Ababa, trying to do some work with the African Union on getting together programs of ratification so that we can get some of these regional treaties into force.
But so part of the treaty says that wherever an African is born, he becomes a citizen of that place, correct?
What the treaty does is to make sure that no child is born stateless. So we take a proactive view of this problem of statelessness. You can no longer have a child who does not have a country of nationality.
Okay.
But at the moment, we've got somewhere between 7 and 10 million stateless people on the continent, depending on how you compute the meaning of statelessness. And how we want to do that is saying no child is born without a nationality. So if a child would be stateless, if a child will be stateless at birth, then the country where the child is born has got to confer nationality on the child as a matter of law. That's the treaty provision.
Fantastic. Now let's move to some solutions. Let's see if we can solve all of Nigeria's problems Africa's problems in 10 minutes. So if we come back to the judiciary, if you could just kind of lay out a a solution set, on understanding now how we got to where we are. What are some of the elements that need to be in this design of a solution to fix the challenges with the judiciary?
I think the first thing is that there are no short-term solutions. I think that's the first, judges are just notoriously difficult to remove. At the moment, we've got two institutions at the federal level, because now we've also federalized our judiciary for the most part, appointments and everything, and centralized them. And we have a Chief Justice who is the most powerful person in the country, given the nature of our political economy at the moment, and who has too many jobs. The Chief Justice is President of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of Nigeria, heads the National Judicial Council, heads the Federal Judicial Service Commission, heads the National Judicial Institute, heads the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, heads the Legal Practitioners Privileges Committee. I could go on. Now, what this means is that Chief Justice is a complex of patronage, no longer of judicial administration. We've got to change that. Return the Chief Justice to a judicial figure, not a figure of patronage. There are several ways in which we can do that. Number one, because the Chief Justice has become a danger to the judicial system. And so
even Nigeria, by extension, a danger to Nigeria. Yeah,
absolutely. So we've got to return the Chief Justice to a lean office. How do we do that? If you go to other countries, number one is very easy. We've got to address the question whether we still need a National Judicial Council and the Federal Judicial Service Commission chaired by one person who gets 2 bites at the cherry. It seems to me the easiest thing is to dispense with one of them. It saves us money and it saves us a lot of trouble. Now, but if we must keep both, we have got to ask ourselves the question whether we should not flip it so that the National Judicial Council reports to the Federal Judicial Service Commission and not the other way around. And why do I say so? The Federal Judicial Service Commission comprises representatives of the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. Attorney General, representatives of the bar, representatives of elected offices. So you've got the natural tensions that go into decision-making at the highest levels. The National Judicial Council comprises 23 people, pretty much every one of whom is appointed by the Chief Justice and accountable to the Chief Justice. That makes it lacking in independence. And so it gives extraordinary powers to the Chief Justice. And it seems to me, first of all, if we must keep it, then the Chief Justice should not chair it. We need to reconstitute it so also that it is not dominated by lawyers and judges, because then incest governs it. There is something to be said in favor of ordinary citizens chairing this kind of thing, because we are the consumers of justice. We're the consumers of the product that the judicial system produces. If the product is just, we will know. If it is not just, we will also know. And we also, the people who pay the bribes to the judges, we will know the judges whom we are giving the bribes. We have their address, and it says we know their amounts. So if tomorrow you see a judge whom you have engineered a bribe to becoming Chief Justice, and you're calling the person my lord, a little bit of something will tell you it's not right. So there are lots of things, a few things we can do to actually alter the balance of power in the judicial system. And then progressively, if we get that right, then what will happen is it will begin to exercise proper discipline on the judges who are in the system. Even if originally those people did not think it was necessary, they will either have to ship up or ship out.
Ship out. Mm-hmm.
It's that simple. They will either have to get their act together or be dumped. The few who are then, or the many who will remain, will be able to do the job properly and will begin to return credibility slowly to the system. But if we're unwilling to do that, it will be difficult, in my view, to get to a point where we can contemplate proper justice system.
And when we look at all you've said, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done by, the political class, by civil society. But as we started out, we saw that some of these institutions are not firing on all the cylinders. So the question again, kind of beating that dead horse, how do we embolden, strengthen civil society to, within all the challenges we have, economic challenges and so on? In your thinking, have you come up with any ideas on how maybe we work with the donor community, some of the international organizations, whatever it may be, to strengthen civil society actors to then in turn hold these other institutions accountable? Any great ideas?
No, actually, I haven't as such, but that doesn't mean there are not. I mean, look at what is happening in Kenya as we speak, right? The young people, they didn't organize any conference. They did not serve tea or coffee in any hotel in Nairobi. But the world is seeing what they are doing. And I don't believe solutions lie in the hands of donors. Donors will jump on our bandwagon when we create our bandwagons. And when we, when we do things that matter, the donors will take notice. And I think our biggest problem in Nigeria is forging a cross-national dialogue. And in my own lifetime, that has happened twice. One was the advocacy to see the military out of power, particularly culminating in the 1993 elections and its aftermath. And so you had a pan-Nigerian argumentation that military rule had passed its sell-by date. And north, south, east, west, Christian, Muslim, male, female, young, old, we could unite around the idea of we were all against the military. Now, or maybe 3 times. The second was anti-third term by Obasanjo. Now, the thing that unites us in Nigeria is we don't like one another. And the idea of one person from one ethnic group holding power for too long was too much for any of us to bear. And I think we could all unite around the idea, whoever this person is, we don't want that. And so, again, we could unite around that and sublimate every other thing. The third, NSAS, didn't necessarily rise to the level of these other two. But, and you could see that the political geography of the NSAS movement did not quite include a good part of the Northwest and a good part of the Northeast. And the agendas there were a little different, which, related to the fragility of life and the fragility, conflict-related fragilities, or insurgency and banditry-related fragilities. But it crossed geopolitical boundaries nevertheless. And I do think that we now need to try and invest, as members of the Nigerian elite, in quotes, in creating cross-cleavage coalitions. It's a triple C. And that is what has happened in Kenya.
Yeah, and I think it was this morning that Ruto said that this is a tribeless demonstration.
Precisely.
Yeah? So I'm wondering if poverty, economic hardship can then create a new tribe, a tribe that sees that we're in this together, we're in this ship together, we're going to sink together. Do you think that that would happen in Nigeria, or ethnic religious divide run too deep, for us to realize that we're all going to hell in the same handbasket?
I think we need to encourage that narrative. I do think it is possible. I spent a lot of time working on Sudan, for instance. And Sudan is another place where that was created. A tribeless, ethnicity-less narrative that united all of the country from Darfur to Port Sudan, and enable the people to see one another as Sudanese, to construct a pan-Sudanese identity that united North Sudan and Abyei, for instance, or the Kordofans, into something bigger than each of those territories. I do think that is possible in Nigeria. And I do think we've got to invest in trying to construct it. Because if we don't, we will not get to where you suggest.
Fantastic. We've got a number of questions from the audience. Let me see if we can get through them. From Emmanuel Ayede, how do we resolve the problem of indigene versus settler dichotomy in Nigeria and Africa?
In in many ways, the indigenous settler dichotomy is a central part of the problematic of indirect rule. Nativization, and Mahmoud Mamdani spends a lot of time on this in his Citizen and Subject, but nativization and ethnicization was inherent in the segregations of colonialism. And if you take northern Nigeria, for instance, the segregations between the walled city, Tudunwada, for instance, and Sabongeri, and meant that you could actually say who came from where. So if you were in Tudunwada, you came from the region, but you were not indigenous to the place. If you were Sabongeri, you didn't come from the region. If you were in the walled city, you were native to the place. And all of these came with different levels of division, right? Now, and so transpose that, when we complain about the past system in, say, South Africa, it wasn't much different in the kinds of societies that we came from, or we come from. And to end that, you do need leadership. And I think at the beginning of our conversation here, I talked about Julius Nyerere. You could also speak about Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah came from Hafasini. Nkrumah's village was much closer, or is much closer to Abidjan than it is to Accra. It was a minority of minorities. But Nkrumah invested in trying to foster a pan-Ghanaian identity. Twi, which is the language that most people speak in Ghana, is an invention. It's a commercial invention. But most Ghanaians will speak Twi, in addition to another Ghanaian language. Most Nigerians will only speak our own ethnic language, and we don't make any effort through curriculum, amongst other things, to foster a crossover in our country. And so the effort to forge a country in which all of us can take pride ends with changing our national anthem from one written by a white mistress or something to another one written by Nigerian, that kind of thing, or recite the national pledge. But the things we actually need to do to foster mutual ownership of the country, people cannot do. When I went to school, we could jump a vehicle returning cattle, transhumant cattle from the south to the north, and make friends in northern Nigeria. And I can easily say I've been to every state in Nigeria. I have families, pretty much, friends with whom I went to school or did things that bond you inside out in every state of Nigeria. My children cannot say they know people beyond a particular status pool or beyond a few territories in Nigeria. And most of our children cannot. How do you build a country like that?
Yeah. So I have another question from Frank Tier. He says, can you please predict a post-democratic era for Nigeria, since the practice of democracy has clearly failed? He seems to resonate some hope. Hence, he has embarked on what I consider to be a very serious, risky, but courageous activism in recent times to save the Nigeria judiciary. I ask this question with a background of having lost hope in democracy. I am, however, caught up in the angst of what happens in the eventual collapse of the current system, which appears inevitable. So, Prof, that's a question for you, and I think it's one that you may need to spend some time on, because I see this growing narrative that democracy has failed, and I think it needs to be addressed.
My brother Frank, first of all, I'm not Babalawo, so I cannot predict a post-democratic dispensation for Nigeria. But secondly, I don't think you'll be doing what you did, or most of us will do what we're doing if we've lost hope in the idea of popular participation. I like to look at these as cycles. And if you look at global history as a matter of fact, you'll see that human community does go through cycles. Cycles of inspiration and cycles of desperation. And you can see those cycles, over the past, say the middle of the 19th century, just looking at the recent cycles and proceeding to where we are now. However you look at the world, cut up the cartography of the world. And we are in a challenging situation, but I see a lot of inspiration. And a lot of people ask me, so why are you all why is it that you always have some form of mad energy? And I'm very simple about it. We have a lot of young people asking questions that our country cannot answer. That means we have inventors everywhere because they will have to find solutions to those questions. And those solutions will come whether Nigeria likes it or not. And there is already a debate going on. There is the 2023 election, in my view, was a debate between the young people who want a country that offers opportunity to everyone, irrespective of where they come from in the country, and a generation that is stuck in the 1960s and in the allocations of mutual recriminations from the 1960s. That debate will have to be resolved, and it will have to be resolved in a civic manner, because the alternative is too impossible to contemplate. All the people who talk about how Nigeria, glibly about how Nigeria will break up, Nigeria will not break up in a nice way. Correct. So all the people who do that should please get off that high horse.
Please.
Please. Anybody talking about breaking up Nigeria, you know, please, please, guys. If there is nothing you take away from this, breaking up Nigeria will not be it is not a tea party. And it will not just be about Nigeria alone. It will be about Africa, because Nigeria is just that significant. So for those of you who think it's going to be that easy, please think again. And because we need to think again, let us try and exhaust all, and I mean every one of the constructive possibilities before we start claiming it is impossible.
Fantastic. I have a question from Professor Okigbo. It's great to listen to you as always, Chidi. Is this not a general decay of all political institutions? While it is useful to examine these institutions individually, should we not be trying to understand the roots of progressive destruction of political institutions generally?
There is a way to, there are two ways to look at it, and I think one is to look at the roots of destruction of political institutions, but the other is to ask the question: have we actually ever had political institutions that worked? Right from before independence, did we have political institutions that worked? And somehow, maybe this is just the crisis of a country that walked into independence as a tea party, as an elite tea party, but tea party nevertheless. And maybe what this presents us with, and for me, that is the constructive dimension to this, is the process of beginning the invention of political institutions we can call our own. Kenya confronted that problem. Although Kenya paid a bigger price than we did in the Mau Mau and its aftermath, Kenya actually went to independence with a few assumptions, and those collapsed under the contradictions of the Kenyatta-Moi era, and began a movement towards the creation of a new constitutional foundation, which eventually the events of December 2007, January 2008 catalyzed in an urgent manner. And that led us to the Constitution of 2010, and the movement that led to the 2010 Constitution in Kenya was nearly 30 years old. By the time that Constitution arrived, Kenyans could own it. Without understanding that movement, it's difficult to understand how Kenyans have got to this point. We have never really had something similar in Nigeria. The closest, but not quite, was the midwife transition of 1977-79. And I do think that we now have the possibility to begin to think about inventing new institutions. I am thinking about that in the context of the judiciary. And I will invite political scientists like Prof. Ibano to begin to work on that with reference to institutions of the political process. And I do challenge Nigerian intellectuals and thinkers. This is the time for every one of us to step forward in each of our every areas: political economy, economics, fiscal governance, institutional engineering of government, the judiciary. You can go on. And then values. We need to begin to reimagine our societies and come up with new thinking that can help us power up a new kind of country.
I can't say amen loud enough. I have a question here from Bertrand Ngu, and I'm going to combine it with a question from Magnus Adiele. Professor Odinkalu has painted a very scary but truthful picture. Judges being of the establishment can't pilot revolutions, detour the poor. The middle class is about to be completely annihilated. Politicians are busy deepening the weaponization of poverty. Does it then mean that there is just no hope for Nigeria? Can there be any way out of the quagmire, or do we just sit by and wait until we probably all die out? Then Magnus added to, how do we get out of the elite capture of the Nigeria state that cuts across all branches of government? What are the possible solutions to deal with this problem beyond the ballot box? So again, this is almost saying our electoral process is broken. It's not going to deliver the goods. Is there something else that we could be doing, to force the kind of Nigeria we want to see? Chidi.
First of all, we've got to imagine the kind of Nigeria we want to see. There's few people are doing that work. It's an intellectual strategic piece of work, and I do think we need to do it. And we've got the kinds of thinkers who can do it. And as I said, we've got to start that. The one thing I have a lot of is hope. I tell my students, I sell hope. I start off my international human rights law class every fall, every September with, if you are in this class, you've come to buy hope, right? And that's really what I'd like to suggest to everyone. You did not escort anybody to Nigeria. The idea that, we sit down, Tinubu and his son and his friends are coming up the country is because we allow them. Oh, Yakubu Mahmoud is writing up results. It's because we allow him. And that is true. He's writing up results that are invented from nowhere. We know that. But you see, we're also too afraid. Last year, I decided, you know what, I've had enough of this nonsense because nobody wanted to talk about the judiciary. Oh, it's rule of law, we are too afraid. So I decided I was going to spend at a minimum of 1 year writing about the judiciary. If I wake up every day, I'll abuse somebody in the judiciary, if it's the only thing I do. But you know what has happened? When I started that, I was getting abused all the time and threats. After the first 2-3 months, people started asking me questions. Now, in the ninth month of that, people are now sending me materials, including senior judges from across the entire spectrum of the judiciary. Senior advocates of Nigeria are now sending me materials. They now want to know how they can support me. I'm telling them, don't send me money. Just line up for some things that we must do. But you know what? When we begin to get champions for transformation in certain areas, sometimes you accident into partners, you accident into collaborators. We need to build a network of collaborators. Some of them may not be people we agree with or people whom we like. But building a country you cannot build a country with only people whom you like. And I would really like to encourage all of us, if we give up hope on trying to make some aspects of our country work, what are the options? What are the alternatives? Walk away? How many of us can walk away to where? Benin Republic or Ghana? Or maybe to the United States? Haven't you noticed that Europe and the Americas are setting up, have decided we are not going to survive, and they have reduced everything, every relationship with our country and our people to migration barriers. And so we've got the talent to make this work. Tinubu will not last forever. We've also got to make subnationals work. The states have got to work. In a lot of states, governors are out to lunch. They're doing dreadful things. They're not doing the things they're supposed to do. Now, a state is a small place, I understand, and it's an easier place to disappear somebody. But I do think it's also an easier place to achieve a few notable victories, and I think we've got to experiment with that too.
Fantastic. There's a question from Oreva Ataya, which I think you've already answered. And the question is, where can they start, since voting didn't work? How can young people protest? But I think you've kind of addressed that. But she's got another question, Oreva Ataya, which is, where can the educated youth in the middle class, what can they do instead of japa or say ignore it till it's too late? And I want to combine that with another question from an anonymous attendee, which is there still room for young, educated middle-class Nigerians to form a new consciousness and collective action that changes the constitution and political structure, assuming that the NSAS and obedient movements achieved what they achieved is not wiped out by the judiciary's behavior? What do you think the young can do instead of just choose to japa or face their business or just join the nonsense.
But isn't this a question of integration? I'm not one for cup half full or half empty. But you ask yourself the question, was NSAS all a failure? And was the obedient movement all a failure? Of course it wasn't. If those had not happened, you would not have had the governor of Abia State, for instance. Just to give you one example. By the way, pretty much the entire, with one or two exceptions, maybe Eyine Abaribe, the entire senatorial contingent from the Southeast was wiped out as a result of that movement. And, you had a lot of political bandits retired as a result of that movement. I don't think we should take it for granted what was achieved. The question is, will we be resilient enough to continue to push the frontiers of that, rather than see that as a defeat, because that did not end in the outcome people would have wished for in the presidency. And part of, I think, our problem is also we continue to, while we have this angst about these things, we continue to afford social capital to people who should not have it. And I ask my colleagues, for instance, in the legal profession, how do you give a bribe to a judge in the morning, last night, and in the morning you are calling the same thief, my lord?
My lord.
Maybe the thing you need to do is, if you have evidence that somebody, a judge or a magistrate, took bribe, then one thing you do is withdraw social approbation from that person. Stop calling them my lord. That is why, for me, for instance, I address all of them by their names. I no longer do my lord to people whom I know are crooked. It's the same thing. Yakubu Mahmoud is crooked. It's very simple. I don't need to tell him. He knows, and I know. And I will not afford him social capital. We've got to find means as citizens to withdraw social capital from people who have given up on it, who have totally spent up their social capital. If we don't do that, the same person whom you know is a crooked person, you go and dobale for them. I'm sorry for you. Don't try and disturb me.
Thank you, Chidi. I have a question from Aminu Usman. It says, Professor Chidi, how does citizenship rights play out in the contestation on rule of law, security, and transitional justice, and the requirements of transitional justice in conflict-compromised areas vis-a-vis the efforts of conflict resolution, and the role of, say, the ICC, as well as community-based conflict resolution mechanisms, and ends with, is it amnesty versus justice?
Mala Aminu, salamu alaikum, sir. Why will you be asking this question and expect me to do it in 3 minutes? It's not possible. But look, on the African continent, we've grappled with these issues in the controversy between, as to the ICC on the one hand, ICC fundamentalists on the one hand, and the peace-justice nexus on the other, and the challenge of sequencing. We confronted that in Sudan, for instance, when the ICC proceeded to indict President Bashir. I led the Darfur Consortium. I led the process of collecting evidence for the ICC in Darfur, starting in 2004. And the people I worked with in that process, all of whom were Sudanese, were going to be wiped out as a result of that. And so I flew to The Hague to negotiate with Maureen Ocampo, the prosecutor of the ICC then, to try and persuade him that this was a bad idea because there were imperatives in Sudan, and we were also negotiating the comprehensive peace agreement in Abuja, of all places. Malam, you know that story. And the belief was, and rightfully so, that it was going to be endangered. And I traveled through the region, met with Meles, with Kagame, with Raila, with all of them who were the leaders of the region. And the message was very clear. Tell this your friend, if this happens, we are going to crash this region in a way that he will not, all of you will not like. And that issue continues to resonate. And I just told you, Aminades over certain AU protocols. One of them is the protocol for the creation of an African Criminal Court, right? And we want to get that established as quickly as possible. In many ways, because African countries believe that we've been failed by the ICC, and the imperatives of peace and justice in fragile societies, returning to where we started, are real. And we've got to preserve a modicum of the foundations for returning peace and justice to our communities in a way that makes sense, so that accountability does not trump peace, but we can also achieve peace without entirely giving up on accountability. That is more art than science. There is no one size fits all to that. And I do think what you raise, actually, Patrick may want to make that an entirely different session on this, how we configure that, given the experience of the continent. Now, from South Africa, for instance, to say Libya, and you saw what happened with Libya and the indictment of Gaddafi and how Libya collapsed and endangered us in Nigeria, as a matter of fact. Because if you do not understand how the Libyan endgame happened, you will not understand how the situation in Nigeria degenerated so swiftly, at particularly the point that it did. And some of the official literature, including intelligence material that was generated in the debate as to how to respond to that from the Nigerian end. But I do think this deserves a lot more time than I have at the moment.
Thank you, Chidi. There's a comment from Jesse Dinju. I honestly and earnestly want to thank you, Professor Chidi, for being the representation of hope for a young person like myself. Listening to you has lightened me up and given me courage. Please keep up what you're doing. There's a mass of us who you are influencing positively. Please, do you have a platform for your admirers to engage with you?
My platform, I don't have a platform. This is a platform. I mean, Nextier is a platform, But I deliberately insisted, and I insist on being on an angry platform like Twitter, for instance, precisely because of that, although I get death threats all the time. But I do think that there is value in engaging in that space, even if sometimes you're liable to be misunderstood. Because, there is reason to, so it's easy to contact me on Twitter, for instance. I like to think I'm able to engage with most people who do, at least take their contacts, and then we establish contacts in different forms. But I'm actually thinking now of probably getting a more reckonable digital presence in a website with the right integration, so that we can make this an easier thing to manage. But I do think communication with the Gen Z, the millennials, and people who are much more digitally savvy is essential if we are going to infuse hope into our country, and we need to.
Chidi, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. I've got 8 more questions in here. We have 2 minutes to go.
Allahu Akbar.
I don't know how we're going to do it, but there's a question from Victor Aliko. Burkina Faso coup junta has announced it will remain in office until 2029 with reasonable support from citizens, citing economic growth dissociation from France and a few bold reforms. Can we trust the Khaki boys, to do as they claim they want to do? What are your thoughts on the proposed single 6-year term for political leaders in Nigeria's federal and state level?
Any amendment on tenure in Nigeria must be such that it must not benefit incumbents. That's the first thing. Otherwise, it becomes tenure elongation, and tenure elongation is going to be problematic in Nigeria, however you think about it. About Burkina and the general coup issue in West Africa, there are things it's difficult to say here, partly because I've been involved tangentially in those conversations, in configuring relationships, because unfortunately, I do not think the initial response of the Nigerian government, particularly following the coup in Niger, was very well thought through. But having said that, I do think Nigeria has learned. There are people around the government, and there are relationships also that we had, which we were not willing to use, and many of those relationships are transboundary because of the nature of our borders. We intermarry, we have intertraded, so we didn't need to be threatening warfare for what required dialogue. It's also not much different in Burkina Faso. The president of Cote d'Ivoire had a Burkinabe passport, was Burkinabe until he decided to run for presidency in Cote d'Ivoire. We do have relationships in all of these places. And on our continent, dialogue is important because we are all interrelated. First of all, 2029 is 5 years away. So you can extract what you want from that. One possibility is, okay, at least they've designated a date on which they will leave. Now, how do we do that? We have history on this, okay? We have precedents. When, what's his name, the former Pierre Buyoya did a coup in East Africa, in Burundi in 1997. he overthrew an elected government and wanted to stay forever. The region blockaded him and then went into a transition with him. That was what led to the Arusha Peace Agreement in 2001. That took 4.5 years. It's not much different from 5 years. But so in my view, what we need to do is engage. And in engaging, we develop new allies. And I've seen that work in my own limited experience. And I cannot claim to have worked in the state as such, apart from my tenure as chair of the National Human Rights Commission. But I've seen a lot, I've dealt with a lot of African presidents and foreign ministers and prime ministers. And it is not a difficult system to navigate if you are willing to engage in it.
Chidi, last question. You're in Transcorp Hilton elevator, ground floor going up to the 10th floor. It's just you and President Tinubu. What's the one thing you want to really imprint on him that he must do to fix the judiciary system? Final word.
Nothing. I'm not going to even try to imprint anything on him because I frankly do not think that President Tinubu is in a place to change the judicial system. I think he's a product of the decrepit system that we've got. And that system will be changed not by him, but in spite of him.
Chidi Odinkalu, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. It's been a real pleasure, having you share on these topics. And for the guests who've joined us this week, please join us again in 2 weeks' time, July 10th. I'll be speaking with Dapo Oyewole. He's a senior special assistant to the president on making international cooperation work. Thank you so much, everyone. And Chidi, thank you so much.
Thanks, my brother. Keep well. And to the participants as well, thanks a lot.